After the partitioning of Vietnam in 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower sent millions of dollars in aid and a handful of military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese Army. With the U.S. supporting South Vietnam, the Soviet Union increased its support for the North. Soon, Soviet-made arms and supplies were flowing to the Viet Cong fighters in the South along what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What had begun as a civil war between South Vietnamese peasants and a small South Vietnamese ruling class had evolved into a Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. At the time, most Americans viewed all communist movements as an attempt by the Soviet Union to spread communism throughout the world. What's more, many feared that a successful communist regime in Vietnam might serve as a model of development for other countries in the region. Their fears were summed up in what was called the domino theory, which warned that if Vietnam became communist, then communism would soon spread to other countries in Southeast Asia.
This means a big chunk of land and millions of people now go from our side to their side. If we lose them, they get them, and vice versa.
To prevent that from happening, the United States did everything it could to support the South Vietnamese government led by President Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was a strong anti-communist, but an unpopular leader who had little support among the Vietnamese people. Like his communist opponents, Diem was not above using torture and assassination to root out his enemies. While his opponents hoped to vote him out of office in the national elections agreed to at Geneva, Diem feared a communist victory by Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North. With U.S. backing, Diem refused to hold the elections, revoking the deal agreed to at Geneva. This act only fueled the rise of the Viet Cong. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong had infiltrated villages throughout South Vietnam and as a result were able to control much of the countryside. As the Vietnam Civil War intensified, President John F. Kennedy increased the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam from several hundred to several thousand. President Kennedy also pressured Ngo Dinh Diem to make the country more democratic. Yet Diem refused to fully reform the government of South Vietnam. As a result, his government was eventually overthrown by the South Vietnamese military and Diem was assassinated. In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy fell victim to an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. With the nation in mourning, America's new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, received a recommendation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the United States take firm measures to help the South Vietnamese. But the president could not send U.S. troops into combat without agreement from the Congress, as the Constitution provides. However, in two separate incidents in August 1964, American Navy destroyers reported being fired upon by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The North Vietnamese accused the ships of spying. President Johnson called the attacks an open aggression on the high seas and asked the Congress for authority to respond. Many would later question whether the first attack had been provoked or if the second ever took place at all. At the time, though, the Senate passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution by a vote of 88-2, giving the President extraordinary power to act. This controversial incident would signal the beginning of active involvement of U.S. forces in Vietnam. In February 1965, 6 months after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, President Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a large bombing campaign against military and economic targets in North Vietnam. In addition to the bombing, President Johnson authorized a buildup of U.S. strength on the ground. At the beginning of 1965, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, General William C. Westmoreland, had 25,000 troops. By the end of the year, he had nearly 200,000.
Westmoreland concluded that the most effective way to defeat the enemy was to search him out, find him, and then use America's overwhelming superiority in terms of firepower, not in terms of personnel. There were more of them than us, but we had bigger guns.
But finding the enemy was not easy. Ordinary farmers by day could become deadly Viet Cong guerrillas by night.
If you were an American soldier, being able to distinguish between who was a friend, who was neutral, and who was an enemy was virtually impossible.
The Viet Cong knew how to use Vietnam's jungles to hide and lay ambushes. U.S. forces countered by spraying defoliants, like Agent Orange, to kill off the foliage and make it more difficult for the enemy to hide. The U.S. chemical arsenal also included napalm, a jellied gasoline which could be dropped in bombs or used in flamethrowers. The burning gasoline stuck to whatever it hit, making for a devastating weapon that often claimed many civilian casualties. Those weapons were part of General Westmoreland's strategy to win the war not in any single battle, but in a steady war inflicting heavier and heavier losses on the enemy until it became too weak to fight. This strategy required large numbers of American troops. By the end of 1967, there were almost 500,000 American servicemen and women in Vietnam. But instead of demoralizing the communist forces, the massive U.S. presence seemed to make them more determined to fight. In November 1967, General Westmoreland had assured the American people that his strategy was working, that U.S. forces had killed so many enemy troops that the war would soon be over. Inside the Johnson administration, however, there were growing doubts about the success of the war. According to the CIA, the massive bombing campaign over the North was having little effect, and morale among the North Vietnamese showed no signs of weakening. As a result, the Pentagon asked President Johnson for permission to expand the areas the U.S. was bombing in the North. Johnson refused. He feared that expanding the war would fuel the growing anti-war sentiment at home.
Hell no, we won't go.
Opposition increased even more in 1968, when the North Vietnamese launched an all-out attack on the South, known as the Tet Offensive. In January 1968, during a ceasefire for Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese attacked more than 20 cities and towns in South Vietnam. The targets included urban areas that were supposedly safe from Viet Cong attack, including Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. From a military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a costly failure. The Viet Cong were almost eliminated as an effective fighting force, while the North Vietnamese army suffered heavy casualties. From a psychological perspective, however, the Tet Offensive was a stunning success. Pictures on American television screens showed that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were capable of attacking anywhere in South Vietnam, undermining General Westmoreland's claim that the war would soon be over. In the wake of the Tet Offensive, General Westmoreland asked President Johnson for still more troops. Facing growing anti-war protests at home, Johnson refused.